Earth's last message to the Galactic Empire. We cautioned you, now it's already too late. My name is Daniel Ashford, and by the time you hear this message, it will already be too late to change anything. I am recording this from a chamber deep beneath the surface of Earth, and the numbers on the screen in front of me are counting down. Not to an attack, to an arrival. Our fleets are already moving through your territory, and nothing you do now will stop them. I want you to listen carefully, High Council, because this is not a threat, it is a record of everything we tried to tell you, and everything you refused to hear. 30 years ago, I stood in a glass hall on the outskirts of a city called Geneva, watching your first ships descend through our clouds like slow silver rain. I was young then, barely old enough to hold a diplomatic post, but I remember every second of that day with a clarity that still makes my hands shake. The ships did not look like weapons. They looked like promises, smooth, patient, almost gentle in the way they settled onto our fields, without so much as bending a blade of grass. Your ambassador at the time was called Vane Ostara, and I remember the way she smiled when she stepped out to greet us. It was not a smile of friendship. It was the smile of someone looking at a child and deciding, quietly, that the child would never grow up. She told us that the Galactic Empire had been watching our world for centuries. She said our species showed promise, but our technology was primitive, our unity fragile, and our understanding of the wider galaxy almost embarrassingly small. She offered us protection, guidance, a place within the great imperial structure, she called it, as if we should have been grateful simply to be noticed. I was the one who translated her words into our language for the assembled leaders of Earth. I remember choosing each word with care, trying to soften what I already sensed was condescension dressed up as kindness. But even softened, the meaning was clear. You did not see us as equals. You saw us as a resource waiting to be catalogued. I stood beside our delegation that day and I said something I have never forgotten, because it was the truth, plain and unafraid. I told her that humanity had survived ice ages that buried entire continents in frost. I told her we had survived plagues that killed a third of our population in a single century, and still we rebuilt. I told her we had fought wars against ourselves that should have ended us, and instead we had learned, slowly and painfully, how to become better. I told her that our patience was not weakness, and our silence was not ignorance. She nodded, the way you nod at a story told by someone you do not quite believe. Then she turned to her aide, a tall figure with pale eyes, and said something in your language that the translator did not catch. I asked what it meant. She smiled again and said it was simply a note for the records. I found out what that note said many years later, buried in a data archive I was never supposed to access. It read, Tier 7, Developing, Non-Threat. 2 words that would shape the next 3 decades of our history. 2 words that told us exactly how little you thought of us, and exactly how much you were about to underestimate. I do not say any of this with anger. Not anymore. Anger is what I felt in those early years, when I was still young enough to believe that words could change minds that had already been made up. What I feel now, recording this message in the last calm moment before everything changes, is something closer to sorrow. Because none of this had to happen. We told you, again and again, in every language we had, that we were not what you thought we were, and you simply were not listening. I remember the day the first tribute agreements were signed. I was in the room, standing near the back, watching men and women who had been elected to protect their nations instead sign away portions of our mineral wealth, our orbital rights, and eventually, our people, in exchange for promises of protection from threats we had never faced before you arrived. I remember thinking, even then, that we were trading something we could never get back for something we had never needed in the first place. Your representatives called it a partnership. I called it, in the privacy of my own reports, the beginning of a debt that would never be repaid, because the terms were never meant to be fair, they were meant to be permanent. I was 26 years old when I first raised a formal objection in front of an imperial overseer. I still remember his name, a broad-shouldered official called Rennick Dorsa, who managed our sector with the bored efficiency of a man counting inventory, rather than governing people. I told him that the resource quotas being demanded of our southern territories would cause hardship among millions of families. He looked at me the way you might look at a child pointing out that dinner was late. He said, and I quote this exactly because I wrote it down that same night, with hands that would not stop trembling, that Earth's contribution was modest compared to what the Empire provided in return. Modest. As if the years off our lives, the hunger in our cities, and the quiet erosion of our independence were a small price for the privilege of being conquered politely. I left that meeting and drove for hours without any destination in mind. I remember pulling over on the side of a road overlooking the ocean, watching the waves fold over each other in the dark, and thinking about every warning we had given you since the day you arrived. We told you we were resilient. We told you we adapted faster than any species you had ever documented. We told you that our history was a long chain of moments where the world expected us to break, and instead we simply changed shape and kept moving forward. You wrote it all down. I know you did, because I have seen the files. But writing something down is not the same as understanding it. You cataloged our warnings the same way you cataloged our art and our music and our language, as curiosities to be studied rather than truths to be respected. I want to tell you about a woman named Nora Bennett, who worked beside me during those early years as part of our joint diplomatic council. She had a way of looking at problems that made even the most tangled situations feel solvable, and she believed, longer than I did, that reason alone could change the direction we were heading in. She used to say that every empire in history eventually meets a mirror it does not expect, a moment where it sees itself clearly for the first time, and by then it is already too late to look away. I did not understand what she meant back then. I understand it perfectly now. There was a night, not long after the tribute agreements expanded for the third time, when Nora and I sat together in an empty conference room, long after everyone else had gone home. The lights above us hummed quietly, and outside the window, the city moved on the way cities do, unaware of the decisions being made in rooms like ours that would shape their children's futures. She turned to me and said something I still carry with me. She said, "They think we are still the same species that greeted them 30 years ago. They have not noticed that we have been changing this entire time, quietly, in the places they never bothered to look." I asked her what she meant, and she simply smiled and told me to wait and watch. I did not understand the full weight of her words until years later, when I finally saw what our scientists and engineers had been building far from imperial oversight, hidden not through deception exactly, but through the simple fact that you never once asked to look closely. You assumed our reports were complete. You assumed a species you had already judged as primitive could not possibly be capable of anything you had not already accounted for. That assumption, more than any weapon we would eventually build, was the single greatest miscalculation in the history of your empire. I am telling you all of this now, in this final message, because I want you to understand something clearly before this transmission ends. What is happening in your territory tonight is not an act of aggression born from nowhere. It is the final result of 30 years of warnings you chose not to hear, delivered by a species you decided, on the very first day you met us, was too small to matter. We told you, in treaties, in petitions, in quiet conversations between officials who tried, again and again, to make you understand what kind of people you were dealing with. We told you that our history was full of moments when the world expected us to disappear, and instead we adapted, we endured, and we grew stronger in ways that were never visible until it was already too late to stop us. You had every chance to listen. I was there for so many of those chances myself, standing in rooms full of officials who smiled politely while dismissing everything we said. I watched hope quietly die in those rooms, over and over, replaced eventually by something colder and more patient, something that did not need your approval anymore. The countdown in front of me continues, and I know that by the time these words reach your council chamber, the first stage of what comes next will already be moving through your outer systems. This is not the beginning of our story. It is the end of a chapter that started the day your ships landed on our fields, and your ambassador looked at us like children who would never grow up. We are not children anymore. We never truly were. And this message, High Council, is simply the last courtesy we intend to offer you. A record of the warnings you ignored, spoken plainly, one final time, before the silence that follows becomes permanent. There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over a species when it stops asking for permission. I did not recognize it at first, because I had spent so many years believing that patience and diplomacy would eventually be rewarded. It took me a long time to understand that the quiet I began noticing among our own people was not defeat, it was preparation. After the third expansion of the tribute agreements, something shifted in the way our leaders spoke to one another in private meetings. I noticed it during a summit held in a coastal city where representatives from every major nation on Earth gathered under the pretense of discussing agricultural quotas demanded by your regional overseers. The public meetings were filled with the same tired arguments, the same polite refusals dressed up as compromises. But in the hallways, in the smaller rooms where the cameras were never allowed, the conversations had changed entirely. I remember a woman named Julia Marsh, a defense coordinator from one of our northern territories, pulling me aside after one such session. She had a quiet intensity about her, the kind of calm that comes from someone who has already decided what needs to be done and is simply waiting for the right moment to act. She asked me a question that stayed with me for years afterward. She asked, "How many more times do you think we need to explain ourselves before we accept that they were never going to listen?" I did not have an answer for her that day. I only remember nodding, because somewhere deep down, I already knew she was right. Over the following years, the pattern of imperial behavior toward Earth became impossible to ignore, even for those of us who had spent our careers trying to find reasonable paths forward. Colonies we had established on nearby moons and asteroids, built through our own labor and resources, were quietly reclassified as imperial territory under the justification of what your officials called administrative efficiency. I remember reading the notice myself, printed in careful, bureaucratic language, explaining that our colonies fell within a jurisdiction boundary that had apparently existed all along, one we had simply never been informed about until it became convenient for you to enforce it. We protested through every proper channel available to us. I personally drafted 17 formal objections over the course of 2 years, each one built on solid legal precedent, each one citing the exact language of the original agreements your ambassador had signed with us decades earlier. Every single one was returned with the same polite dismissal, citing clauses that seemed to shift meaning depending on who was reading them and what outcome the Empire preferred that week. It was during this period that I first learned what it meant to watch your own people be treated as expendable. Your border conflicts with a species I will only refer to as the Kasari, a proud and technologically capable people who had resisted imperial expansion for generations, required soldiers. Your own citizens, I later learned, were reluctant to serve in these campaigns, having grown comfortable within the safety of the imperial core worlds. So instead, your recruiters turned to territories like ours, offering what they called opportunities for advancement to young men and women from Earth who had few other paths available to them. I met one of these young men before he shipped out to a conflict zone he had never heard of, until the recruiter arrived in his village. His name was Peter Lang, and he was barely 20 years old, with an easy laugh and a habit of talking about his plans to return home and open a small workshop repairing farm equipment. He told me, with the kind of hope that only exists in people who have not yet been disappointed by the world, that serving in the Imperial forces for a few years would give him enough resources to build the life he wanted for his family. I never learned exactly what happened to him. I only know that of the several thousand young people from our territories who were sent to that border conflict, fewer than half returned home, and those who did came back, changed in ways that our medical systems, still limited by imperial restrictions on advanced technology, were poorly equipped to help them recover from. I carried Peter's laugh with me for years afterward, a small detail that reminded me exactly what these grand strategic decisions actually cost in human terms. Every quota, every tribute, every reclassified colony represented real people, real families, real futures quietly rewritten by decisions made in rooms where none of them had a voice. Our scientists faced a different kind of loss, one that was harder to see but no less painful. I remember a brilliant researcher, a physicist, called Victor Cole, who had spent nearly a decade developing new approaches to energy storage that could have transformed how our cities functioned. When Imperial oversight officials discovered his research during a routine inspection, they classified it as a resource of strategic interest and required him to hand over every notebook, every prototype, every line of code he had written, in exchange for what they called fair compensation, which amounted to a fraction of what the research was actually worth. Victor came to my office the week after that happened, and I remember him sitting across from my desk, staring at his hands, saying almost nothing for nearly 20 minutes. When he finally spoke, he told me that he had learned an important lesson. He said that from now on, anything he discovered that truly mattered, he would keep only in his own memory, where no inspection could ever reach it. I did not realize at the time how many of our scientists had quietly reached the same conclusion. It was around this period that I began attending closed council sessions where our own leaders discussed, in careful and measured language, the possibility of something none of us had dared to say aloud before. The word they used was independence, though none of them meant it in the way you might expect. They did not mean open defiance, not yet. They meant something quieter, a gradual, invisible withdrawal of cooperation, disguised carefully enough that it would take years for anyone in your empire to notice what was actually happening. I remember the first time this idea was presented formally, in a meeting attended by representatives from nearly every major territory on Earth, along with military coordinators like Julia Marsh and diplomatic officials like Nora Bennett. The proposal was simple in its wording, but enormous in its implications. Instead of continuing to fight every unfair demand through official channels that had proven useless time and again, we would begin quietly consolidating our own resources, our own research, and our own defenses, all while continuing to present the same cooperative face to imperial overseers that we always had. I remember someone in that meeting asking the obvious question: what happens when they eventually notice? The answer given, calm and measured, has stayed with me ever since. By the time they notice, it will already be too late for the answer to matter. I want to be honest with you now, in this message, about how gradual and quiet this transformation truly was. There was no single dramatic moment where humanity declared its intentions. There was only a slow accumulation of small decisions, each one reasonable on its own, each one nearly invisible to outside observers who had already decided we were not worth watching closely. Our governments began sharing research more freely with one another, something that had rarely happened even among our own nations in earlier decades. Old rivalries that had once made cooperation difficult were quietly set aside, not through some sudden burst of unity, but through the practical recognition that survival required setting aside old grievances in favor of something larger. I remember sitting in meetings where leaders who had spent years disagreeing on nearly everything found themselves nodding in agreement on a single point. Whatever divided us mattered far less than what we now faced together. Meanwhile, publicly, nothing changed at all. We continued attending Imperial Council sessions with the same polite cooperation we always had. I personally continued submitting formal objections to unfair tribute demands, knowing full well they would be dismissed, because maintaining that appearance of continued diplomatic effort was itself part of the strategy. Your officials needed to believe that we were still playing the same game we had always played, following the same rules we had always followed, waiting patiently for a fairness that would never come. I remember Rennick Dorsa, the same overseer who had once told me our tribute contribution was modest, commenting to me during a routine inspection that Earth seemed unusually compliant in recent months. He said it almost approvingly, the way someone might praise a pet for finally learning obedience. I remember smiling politely and thanking him for the observation, while inside, I understood exactly how wrong his assessment truly was. There is a particular kind of discipline required to maintain a deception of this scale for years without a single mistake. I think about this often, even now, recording what may be the final honest words I ever speak to your empire. Discipline was not something we lacked, whatever your officials believed about us. If anything, it was the very thing you consistently underestimated, the same patience and resilience I had tried to explain to your first ambassador on the day her ships landed on our fields. By the time 5 more years had passed, something remarkable had happened, something that would have seemed impossible to the leaders who first sat in that closed council session. Earth had become, in practice if not in name, a single unified body, coordinating research, defense, and resources across every territory and nation, all while continuing to present the same fractured, cooperative, non-threatening appearance to your empire that we had maintained since the very first day of contact. I remember standing on a balcony overlooking the same coastal city where that early summit had taken place, watching the lights of the harbor below, and thinking about how far we had come without a single imperial official noticing the shift. It was not deception in the way your officials might imagine it, built on lies and false promises. It was simply the quiet, patient work of a species finally deciding to stop waiting for permission to grow. Nora Bennett found me on that same balcony that evening, and she reminded me of something she had said years earlier, back when I still did not fully understand what she meant. She said that every empire eventually meets a mirror it does not expect. She told me that the mirror was almost finished now, and soon, whether your empire was ready or not, you would finally see us clearly for exactly what we had become. I did not know then exactly what form that mirror would take. I only knew, standing there in the quiet of that evening, that we had stopped asking you to understand us, and had started simply becoming something you would eventually be forced to understand whether you wanted to or not. I was finally shown what we had built on a morning that began like any other, with no ceremony and no warning, which felt strangely appropriate given everything that followed. Julia Marsh arrived at my office without an appointment, something she had never done before in all the years I had known her, and told me simply that it was time I understood what my years of diplomatic effort had actually been protecting. She took me to a facility built into the side of a mountain range far from any major city, a place with no official name on any public record, accessible only through a series of checkpoints staffed by people who greeted Julia with the kind of respect usually reserved for someone far above her official rank. I remember the elevator ride down, long enough that I began to wonder exactly how far beneath the surface we were traveling, and I remember the doors finally opening onto a chamber, so vast that my first instinct was to assume I was looking at a trick of scale, some clever use of mirrors or projection. I was not looking at a trick. I was looking at a shipyard, built entirely underground, housing vessels unlike anything I had seen in any imperial catalog, any trade negotiation, any technical briefing shared with us over the past 3 decades. Julia let me stand there in silence for a long moment before she spoke. She told me that what I was looking at represented nearly 15 years of work, conducted by scientists and engineers from every nation on Earth, coordinated in secret through channels that even most of our own government officials were never fully briefed on. She told me that Victor Cole, the physicist whose research had been seized years earlier, had quietly rebuilt his work from memory, refining it further with the help of colleagues who had learned the same painful lesson he had, and that his refined designs now powered every vessel in the chamber before me. I asked her the question that felt most urgent in that moment, standing beneath ceilings so high they nearly disappeared into shadow. I asked her how something of this size had remained completely invisible to imperial oversight for so many years. Her answer has stayed with me ever since, because it explained everything about the nature of your empire's greatest weakness. She said that your inspectors only ever looked where they expected to find something interesting. They surveyed our cities, our declared research facilities, our public shipping lanes, because those were the places a species like yours, accustomed to conquering worlds that behaved predictably, assumed a lesser civilization would concentrate its efforts. You never once considered that we might build somewhere you had not thought to look, because doing so would have required you to imagine us as capable of the same strategic patience your own empire prided itself on. I want to explain something now about the psychology behind everything that happened next, because I believe understanding it matters more than simply recounting events. Your empire's greatest blind spot was never a lack of resources or intelligence. It was an assumption so deeply embedded in your culture that none of your officials ever thought to question it, that a species you had classified as developing would naturally seek your approval before taking any significant action. You expected us to ask permission before growing stronger. You expected us to announce our progress, to submit reports, to request guidance, because every other species your empire had encountered throughout its long history had behaved exactly that way, conditioned by generations of imperial dominance to seek validation before acting. We simply stopped asking. I remember Julia explaining this to me as we walked between the massive hulls of vessels still under construction, their surfaces catching the light in ways that reminded me of something between deep ocean creatures and old-world cathedrals, functional and beautiful in equal measure. She told me that the moment we understood you would never grant us fair treatment through negotiation, we made a quiet decision as a species. We would stop reporting our progress entirely. We would continue submitting the same tribute payments, the same compliance documents, the same polite diplomatic correspondence, while simultaneously building something far beyond anything those documents suggested we were capable of. I asked her what these ships were designed to do, and she led me to a smaller chamber adjacent to the main shipyard, where a woman I had not yet met was reviewing data on a series of illuminated displays. Julia introduced her as Nora Bennett's sister, a woman named Ellen Bennett, who had spent the better part of a decade working alongside Victor Cole on weapons systems research that drew on principles we had deliberately never disclosed during any trade negotiation with your empire. Ellen explained, with the careful precision of someone who had spent years thinking about how to describe her work to someone outside her field, that the technology powering these vessels was not simply an improvement on anything Imperial engineers had developed. It was built on an entirely different foundation, one rooted in principles of energy manipulation that our scientists had discovered independently, without ever revealing these discoveries in any of the technical exchanges your officials had periodically requested from us over the years. I asked her why we had never shared any of this during those exchanges, even in small amounts, as a gesture of goodwill. She looked at me for a long moment before answering, and her answer explained something I had never fully considered before that day. She said that every piece of technology we had ever shared with your empire during those exchanges had eventually been used against us in some form, whether through resource extraction methods that damaged our environment, or through weapons systems deployed in border conflicts where our own people were sent to fight and die on your behalf. She said that our scientists made a collective decision, quietly and without any formal announcement, to treat every future discovery as something to be protected rather than shared, understanding that trust, once broken repeatedly, cannot simply be rebuilt through further acts of goodwill. I remember standing in that chamber, surrounded by technology that represented decades of hidden human effort, and feeling something shift inside me that I had not expected. It was not triumph, not exactly. It was something closer to grief, mixed with a strange kind of pride I had never allowed myself to feel before. Grief, because I understood in that moment exactly how much trust had been broken to bring us to this point, how many warnings had gone unheeded, how many young people like Peter Lang had been sacrificed before we finally decided that patience alone would never protect us. And pride, because despite everything, despite 30 years of being underestimated and dismissed, humanity had built something extraordinary in the shadows, patiently, without seeking anyone's approval. Julia showed me one more thing before we left that facility, something she said would help me understand the full scope of what had been happening beyond the borders of Earth itself. She brought up a star map on one of the illuminated displays, showing a series of small marked locations scattered across sectors of space that, according to every official record filed with your empire, contained nothing of interest. These were our dark colonies, she explained. Small settlements established over the past decade in systems deliberately chosen for their distance from imperial sensor networks, populated by volunteers who understood they were leaving Earth to help build something that might never be finished in their own lifetimes. She told me that these colonies served two purposes. First, they allowed us to develop and test new technology, far from any location your empire might inspect. Second, and more importantly, they ensured that even if Earth itself faced retaliation for what was about to happen, humanity as a species would continue, scattered across these hidden outposts, carrying forward everything we had built and everything we had learned. I asked her how many people knew about all of this, expecting the number to be small given how successfully it had remained hidden. Her answer surprised me. She told me that by that point, nearly 2 million people across Earth and our hidden colonies were directly involved in some aspect of this effort, whether through research, construction, logistics, or simply providing support to the families of those working on the project. 2 million people, coordinated across decades, maintaining absolute discretion, all while your empire continued to classify us as a non-threat, requiring only occasional oversight. I think about that number often now, in these final moments before this message reaches you. 2 million people kept a secret of this magnitude for years, not because they were forced to, but because they understood, collectively and without needing to be told twice, exactly what was at stake. The final piece of this story, the piece that brought us to the moment I am recording this message from, began with an ultimatum your empire delivered less than a year ago. I remember the exact day it arrived because I was the one who received the transmission personally, forwarded through diplomatic channels from an official I had never met before, a stern-voiced administrator who introduced himself only as Overseer HFY. He informed me, in language that made no attempt to soften what he was actually saying, that the Imperial Council had grown concerned about what they called irregularities in Earth's recent tribute reporting. He said that inconsistencies detected in our declared resource output suggested we were withholding assets that rightfully belonged to the Empire under the terms of our original agreement. He gave us 30 days to submit to a full audit of every research facility, every industrial site, and every colony under human control, warning that failure to comply would be treated as a breach of our standing agreement, subject to what he called corrective action. I understood immediately what that phrase meant, because I had read enough Imperial history by that point to know exactly what corrective action had meant for other species who had failed to meet your empire's expectations. It meant punitive bombardment of key population centers, followed by forced annexation and the installation of a compliant puppet government drawn from whatever remained of the local leadership willing to cooperate. I brought this ultimatum immediately to our full council, and I remember the room falling silent as I read the transmission aloud. For a moment, I thought perhaps this would be the moment our carefully built plans collapsed under the weight of an impossible choice: submit to an audit that would reveal everything we had spent 15 years building, or refuse and face immediate consequences before we were fully ready. But Julia Marsh, sitting at the far end of that table, simply looked at me and asked a single question. She asked whether 30 days was enough time for the final preparations already underway to be completed. I did not know the answer myself, but Ellen Bennett, who had joined the council specifically for this meeting, confirmed that our fleets, our defenses, and our hidden colonies were as ready as they would ever be. She said that we had always known this moment would eventually arrive, that your empire's patience with our supposed compliance would eventually run out, and that we had built everything with exactly this kind of ultimatum in mind. I remember the vote that followed, quiet and unanimous, taken not with the fear I might have expected given the stakes involved, but with a kind of calm resolve that reminded me of everything Nora Bennett had told me years earlier about mirrors and empires. We would not submit to the audit. We would not continue pretending. The 30 days given to us by Overseer HFY would instead be used to finalize the deployment of every fleet, every hidden asset, every carefully constructed piece of the plan that had been building quietly since the day we first realized diplomacy alone would never be enough. I sent our official response to Overseer HFY myself, exactly 7 days before this recording, informing him that Earth would not be submitting to any audit and that our tribute obligations under the original agreement were, effective immediately, considered void given decades of documented mistreatment that we had, for the first time, chosen to formally and publicly catalog in our response. I do not know what his reaction was upon receiving that message, though I imagine it was not one of concern. I imagine, given everything I know about how your empire has always viewed us, that he simply filed our response as another act of predictable defiance from a species too small to truly matter, the same way our original warnings had been filed away decades earlier by Ambassador Vane Ostara. That, High Council, was the final mistake your empire will ever make regarding humanity. Because even as Overseer Halvek was filing our refusal into whatever administrative archive awaited it, the ships I stood beside in that underground shipyard were already beginning their final preparations for deployment. The colonies scattered quietly across sectors your sensors had never bothered to search were already receiving their final instructions. And the 2 million people who had spent years building something you never once thought to look for were already taking their positions, ready for the moment that I am now recording this message from, the moment where diplomacy finally, completely, and permanently gives way to something that can no longer be stopped through negotiation or delay. We told you, again and again, across 30 years of warnings you chose to file away, rather than understand. And now, High Council, the time for filing anything away has passed. The countdown on the screen in front of me has changed since I began recording this message, and I want to describe to you, plainly and without exaggeration, exactly what is happening across your territory as I speak these words. 12 hours ago, our fleets departed from every hidden shipyard, every dark colony, and every quietly prepared launch point we have maintained across the years I have already described to you. They did not travel through any of the trade corridors your sensor networks monitor closely. They moved instead through routes charted by Ellen Bennett's research team, paths that exploit gaps in Imperial detection systems that your engineers never thought to close, because closing them would have required believing that a species like ours could ever chart a course through territory you considered entirely your own. I received the first confirmation of successful deployment nearly 4 hours ago, relayed through a communication system built specifically for this purpose, one that cannot be traced back to any origin point your empire would recognize. Julia Marsh sent the message herself, from a command vessel positioned at what she called a coordination point, somewhere beyond the borders of what your star charts label as Imperial space. Her message was brief. She said simply that every fleet had reached its designated position without detection, and that the second phase of deployment was proceeding exactly as planned. I want you to understand something about what is happening right now, because I believe it matters more than the tactical details themselves. This was never meant to be a surprise in the way your officials might imagine it. We are not attacking from nowhere, striking without warning against a council that never saw us coming. Every action taking place across your territory tonight was preceded by years of documented warnings, filed through official channels, recorded in transmission logs that exist in your own archives right now, waiting to be reviewed by anyone who finally decides to look. I think about Ambassador Vane Ostara often in these final hours, wondering whether she ever revisited that early conversation where I told her humanity's patience should never be mistaken for weakness. I wonder whether she remembers writing those 2 words into her records so many years ago, Tier 7, non-threat, and whether she has any understanding now of exactly how much that single classification cost your empire. Our fleets are moving simultaneously across 12 separate sectors, each one targeting infrastructure that has, for decades, allowed your empire to project power and control across territories far larger than any single species should reasonably be able to manage. I am not describing this to frighten you, High Council, though I suspect fear may be an unavoidable response to what you are about to experience. I am describing this because I believe you deserve, after everything, one final clear account of what your dismissal of our warnings has ultimately produced. Shipyards that have produced Imperial vessels for generations are being disabled, not destroyed carelessly, but methodically, in ways designed to prevent further military production without causing unnecessary loss of life among the workers stationed there. Julia Marsh insisted on this approach from the very beginning of our planning, and I remember her explaining her reasoning during one of our earliest strategy sessions. She said that our goal was never to become the kind of empire that treats other beings as expendable resources, the way we had been treated for 30 years. Our goal was simply to ensure that your empire could never again project that kind of power over Earth or over any other species you had underestimated in the same way. Command relays that coordinate Imperial fleet movements across multiple sectors have been compromised through methods Ellen Bennett's team developed specifically for this purpose, methods drawing on the same principles of energy manipulation I described earlier, applied here not as weapons in the traditional sense, but as tools capable of disrupting communication networks your empire has always assumed were completely secure. I am told that within the next several hours, coordination between your regional command centers will become increasingly difficult, not through destruction, but through a careful, deliberate severing of the connections your empire has always relied upon to project unified authority across such vast distances. Supply lines that have allowed your border campaigns against species like the Kasari to continue for years. Campaigns that consumed the lives of young people like Peter Lang, from territories your empire considered too small to matter, are being disrupted as well. I think of this particular action as something closer to justice than aggression, though I recognize that your officials may see it differently. For years, our people were sent to fight and die in conflicts we had no genuine stake in, conflicts that existed only because your empire needed expendable soldiers from territories it did not value highly enough to protect from that kind of sacrifice. Ending your capacity to continue extracting that sacrifice from us and from other species facing similar treatment feels to me like the very least we owe to everyone who never returned home. I want to address something directly now, because I believe your council deserves complete honesty in these final moments before this message reaches you. What is happening across your territory tonight was never about conquest. I have heard this word used throughout our own private discussions over the years, always followed by firm correction from leaders like Julia Marsh and Nora Bennett, who understood from the very beginning that becoming conquerors ourselves would mean losing something essential about who we had fought so hard to remain throughout this entire ordeal. We do not want your worlds. We do not want your resources, though we understand you took so many of ours without any genuine reciprocity. We do not want to rule over species like the Kasari, who deserve the same right to self-determination that we have spent 30 years fighting to reclaim for ourselves. What we want, simply and completely, is for your empire to finally understand something it should have understood the very first day your ships landed on our fields. We are not a resource to be cataloged. We are not a tier to be assigned. We are not a species whose warnings can be filed away and forgotten, while our people suffer the consequences of decisions made in rooms we were never truly welcomed into as equals. I received another message from Julia Marsh just minutes ago, informing me that the third phase of our deployment has begun successfully, targeting the administrative centers responsible for coordinating tribute collection across territories like ours. She told me that resistance encountered so far has been minimal, and that Imperial forces stationed in these sectors appear to have been caught almost entirely unprepared, exactly as our years of careful, patient planning intended. I do not celebrate this news the way I might have imagined celebrating such a moment years ago, back when anger still burned hot enough in me to want something closer to revenge for everything we had endured. What I feel instead, listening to Julia's calm, measured voice relaying updates from across your territory, is something closer to a quiet, exhausted relief. Relief that 30 years of careful, patient preparation has finally reached the moment it was always building toward. Relief that the 2 million people who dedicated years of their lives to this effort in complete secrecy will finally see the results of everything they sacrificed to build. Nora Bennett sent me a brief message as well, shortly after Julia's update, and I want to share her words with you now, because I believe they capture something important about how we have approached this entire final phase of our long, difficult relationship with your empire. She wrote simply that the mirror she had spoken of years earlier had finally arrived, and that whatever your council saw reflected back at itself in these coming hours, we hoped it would finally understand something that 30 years of warnings had failed to communicate. I am recording the final portion of this message now, aware that within hours, this transmission will reach your council chamber, arriving long after the events I have described have already unfolded across your territory. There is no version of tonight where diplomacy still functions as a viable path forward. That path closed the moment Overseer Halvek filed our final refusal into whatever administrative archive awaited it, treating our clearly stated position as nothing more than predictable defiance from a species he still believed to be beneath serious consideration. I do not know what will happen in the days and weeks that follow this message reaching your council. I do not know how your remaining forces will respond, whether with further aggression or with the kind of reflection Nora Bennett hoped for when she spoke of mirrors and empires. What I do know, with complete certainty, is that whatever comes next will be shaped by a species your empire chose never to understand, despite 30 years of clear, repeated opportunities to do exactly that. We told you. We told you when your first ambassador landed on our fields and looked at us like children who would never grow up. We told you when your officials dismissed our objections to unfair tribute demands as the complaints of a species too small to matter. We told you when we warned you, again and again, that our patience should never be mistaken for weakness, and our silence should never be mistaken for ignorance. You had 30 years to listen, High Council. 30 years of warnings, delivered plainly, honestly, and repeatedly through every channel available to us. And now, as this message reaches you, I want you to understand one final thing with complete clarity. What comes next is no longer something either of us can control through words alone. It is simply the result, inevitable and unavoidable, of everything you chose not to hear. I have been recording this message for what feels like hours now, though the counter in front of me tells me it has only been a fraction of that time. There is a strange way that moments like this stretch and compress at once, each memory I have shared with you taking on a weight that seems to slow the passage of time itself, even as the actual events unfolding across your territory move forward with a speed that cannot be paused or reconsidered. I want to spend these final moments telling you something simpler than everything I have already described, because I believe simplicity matters more than strategy when it comes to understanding what has truly happened between our species over these past 30 years. This was never about proving humanity's strength, though I understand that is likely how your historians will eventually record it, if your empire survives long enough to write that history at all. It was never about demonstrating some grand destiny we believed ourselves entitled to, the way your own empire has always framed its expansion across the stars. It was, from the very beginning, about something far more basic than any of that. It was about being seen clearly, for exactly what we were, rather than what your empire assumed we must be based on a single hurried assessment made on the very first day your ships descended through our clouds. I think about Ambassador Vane Ostara's smile often, that particular expression she wore when she looked at our delegation all those years ago, the smile of someone who had already decided, before we had even finished speaking, exactly how much or how little we deserved to be taken seriously. I have carried that smile with me through every meeting, every dismissed objection, every quiet moment of grief over young people like Peter Lang, who paid the price for decisions made by officials who never once considered that we might become something other than what they had already decided we were. I do not know if Vane Ostara is still alive, still serving in some capacity within your council. I do not know if she will hear this message, or if it will simply become another archived record, filed away the same way our warnings always were. But I want her, and every official who ever looked at us with that same dismissive smile, to understand something clearly in these final words. You were never wrong that humanity started small. You were never wrong that our technology, 30 years ago, was primitive compared to what your empire had already achieved across countless star systems and countless centuries of expansion. Where you were wrong, catastrophically and irreversibly wrong, was in believing that where we started determined where we would inevitably end up. You mistook a single moment in our long history for the entirety of what we were capable of becoming. Every warning I have described throughout this message, every quiet objection raised in council chambers that were ultimately ignored, every careful explanation of our resilience that your officials filed away as diplomatic theater rather than genuine insight, was an opportunity for your empire to understand something that should have been obvious from the very beginning. A species that had survived ice ages, plagues, and wars against itself was never going to simply accept permanent subjugation as the final chapter of its story. I remember, near the very beginning of this message, describing the moment I first learned what Tier 7, non-threat, actually meant for our future. I want to close this message now by telling you what those two words ultimately produced, because I believe the outcome deserves to be stated plainly, without the careful diplomatic language I once used out of necessity in those early years. 2 words, written carelessly into an official record by an ambassador who believed she was simply noting an obvious and unimportant fact, produced 30 years of quiet resentment that eventually transformed into 30 years of equally quiet preparation. It produced 2 million people willing to dedicate years of their lives to a project they might never see completed within their own lifetimes. It produced hidden shipyards built into mountains, dark colonies scattered across sectors your sensors never thought to search, and technology developed specifically because we understood, long before your empire ever considered it a possibility, that trust broken repeatedly cannot simply be rebuilt through further diplomatic gestures. Those 2 careless words, written on the very first day of our relationship with your empire, ultimately produced everything that is happening across your territory as I record these final sentences. I want to tell you something about Julia Marsh, Nora Bennett, Ellen Bennett, and Victor Cole, the people whose names I have shared throughout this message, because I believe their stories matter more than any strategic detail I could offer about our fleets or our technology. None of them set out 30 years ago hoping for a moment like this one. Julia Marsh wanted, more than anything, for our objections to be heard through proper diplomatic channels, sparing our people the cost of the alternative we eventually chose. Nora Bennett spent years believing that reason alone could change the direction we were heading in, long after I had personally given up on that possibility. Victor Cole simply wanted to conduct his research freely, without having his discoveries seized and repurposed by officials who saw his work as nothing more than a resource to be extracted. Every single one of them would have preferred a different outcome than the one I am describing to you now. Every single one of them tried, in their own way, to find a path forward that did not require what is currently unfolding across your territory. It was only after years of watching every reasonable effort dismissed, every genuine attempt at cooperation met with further exploitation, that they finally accepted what I had already begun to understand on the balcony overlooking that coastal harbor, years earlier, when Nora first spoke to me about mirrors and empires. Sometimes, understanding arrives too late to prevent what follows it. I believe that is exactly what is happening to your empire tonight, High Council. You are finally understanding something about humanity that 30 years of warnings failed to communicate, and that understanding has arrived at precisely the moment when nothing you now realize can change the course already set in motion. I want to say clearly, for whatever record this message eventually becomes, that this was never our preferred outcome. We did not want to become a species defined by conflict with your empire, the way you have defined yourselves, through centuries of expansion and conquest across countless worlds. We wanted, simply, to be treated as equals, to have our warnings taken seriously, to have our people protected from exploitation the same way your own citizens have always been protected within the safety of your core worlds. That path was available to your empire for 30 years. It was available every time I raised an objection that was dismissed, every time Julia Marsh questioned whether patience still made sense, every time Nora Bennett hoped that reason might yet prevail. Your empire chose, again and again, to close that path rather than walk down it, believing that a species you had classified as developing would never possess the will or the capability to eventually close it from the other side instead. I am ending this message now, High Council, because the counter in front of me has finally reached 0, and because I believe I have said everything that truly needs to be said. What happens next is no longer something I can influence through further words, no matter how carefully chosen. It is simply the outcome, inevitable and unavoidable, of 30 years spent trying to explain something that should never have needed explaining in the first place. We told you when your first ships descended through our clouds, and your ambassador looked at us as though we were children who would never grow up. We told you when your officials called our contribution modest, dismissing the hardship it caused across our territories. We told you when we warned you, plainly and repeatedly, that our patience should never be mistaken for weakness. We told you when we refused your final audit, choosing instead to formally and publicly catalog 30 years of documented mistreatment for the first time in our history. We cautioned you, High Council, again and again, through every channel available to us. Across 3 decades of warnings you chose to file away rather than understand. And now, as this message reaches you, I want you to understand one final, simple truth. It is already too late for anything to change what has already begun. This is not a warning anymore. It never truly was, not in these final hours. It is simply a record, spoken plainly and honestly, of everything that led us to this moment, offered to you not out of cruelty or triumph, but because even now, after everything, I still believe you deserve to understand exactly what your dismissal of us has ultimately produced. This is Daniel Ashford, speaking not as a diplomat, and not as a soldier, but simply as one voice among the many who tried, for 30 years, to make you listen. We cautioned you. You did not listen. And now, it is already too late.